Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. At least 9 wounded in Russian shelling of Kherson. Floodwaters from Kyiv Dam destruction reach Kyiv. Plus, Russia's Shoigu demands faster delivery of weapons and ammunition to frontline troops. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Russian shelling has hurt at least 9 people in the southern Ukrainian city of Kherson late on Thursday as residents were being evacuated because of the flooding caused by the destruction of the Kyiv Dam. The Prosecutor General's office initially said 1 person had been killed by the Russian shelling, but later said no deaths had been reported. A witness in Kherson spoke of hearing what appeared to be artillery fire. Kherson lies on the Dnipro, about 60 kilometers downstream from the Kyiv Dam. Russia has accused Ukrainian forces of shelling rescue workers in Russian-occupied parts of the Kherson, and each side blames the other for the destruction of the hydroelectric station and dam.
We express our profound concern over the reported shelling of Kherson, Ukraine, during the evacuation from the areas flooded after the destruction of the dam of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. According to the Kherson local authorities, at least 9 people, including police, medical, and rescue personnel, were wounded today in the city as a result of shelling that occurred during the ongoing evacuation operation. We strongly condemn shellings of evacuation areas and call on the Russian Federation to cease such attacks and allow the evacuation teams to safely help the affected civilian population. We also urge the Russian Federation to grant full, safe, and unimpeded access to the affected areas of the left bank of the Dnipro River, which are currently under its military control, for humanitarian actors, in particular those from the United Nations and ICRC, to help affected local residents.
Meanwhile, floodwaters unleashed by the destruction of the dam reached regional center Kyiv on Thursday. Water levels were rising quickly in the city, submerging homes and roads. It's not known how many people may have died as a result of the flooding, but the Russian-installed mayor of Novokakhovka, near where the dam is located, says at least 5 people have died, and the total death toll is sure to be much higher. Kherson's Ukrainian governor, Alexander Prokudin, said 68% of the flooded territory was in the Russian-occupied left bank of the Dnipro River. A spokesperson for the United Nations Humanitarian Agency is describing the situation in Ukraine's Kherson as very difficult. Mr. Saviano Bro says this in connection to the burst Kyiv Dam. According to him, the consequences of the destruction would have a long-term impact, potentially affecting agriculture in the region and residents' access to drinking water. Ukraine is a major global grain and oilseed grower and exporter. The destruction of the dam has also made it impossible to navigate parts of the Dnipro River and deprive Kyiv of an important agricultural export route.
It's a very difficult situation for people in Kherson right now because they are already suffering the consequence of the war for a long time. So it's a new dimension of a situation that was already bad. The humanitarian needs in Kherson are high. Since the government of Ukraine retook control of the city in November last year, hostilities didn't stop. Otherwise, it increased, actually, impacting people's ability to access the most basic services. Water is a challenge and has always been a challenge in Kherson. Electricity has been a challenge. Access to food is a challenge. So now the situation is only getting worse. And the coping strategies or coping mechanisms for this population is already really low. the extension of the flooding is massive and the water is still increasing. So we do know of people, particularly in areas that are now under Russian control, at least the image that we have seen and information that we gather, that people are really stranded in areas completely flooded without any means to live. In the areas that are under Ukrainian control, people are trying to live, but they want to stay close to their homes. So most of the people that evacuated, we have more or less around 2,000 people that they had to leave their homes. Their homes were flooded. They are trying to stay close. They are staying here. Some city in parts that are not flooded of the same city. The consequence of the disaster is not going to be seen. It's not going to stop when the waters recede. The impact is going to be long term. The agriculture is going to be impacted. As we all know, this area is heavily contaminated by mines and explosives. It has a consequence for this as well. Irrigation systems are broken. Water supplies, 700,000 people depends on water from the reservoir from Kakhovka. The level of the reservoir is dropping, so we are at risk of having 700,000 people that cannot have clean water at home. Food production, as I mentioned, is going to be for a long time, so the response is going to have to last for long as well.
Staying with the destruction of the dam, Ukrainian soldiers have been using drones to deliver bottled water to desperate villagers trapped in the upper stories of their homes by floods in Russian-controlled South Ukraine. Drone flyers of the 406th Separate Artillery Brigade use the military drones for a peaceful purpose, dropping water bottles to people hanging out of upper windows in the village of Oleski in the Kherson region. In a video released earlier, trapped villagers waved frantically as drones flew by overhead, dropping water, that is drinking water. A young boy waved and smiled after he caught one of the bottles. A rescuer described evacuees from the flood-stricken southern region of Kherson as exhausted and weak 2 days after the destruction of the dam submerged villages, fields and roads. One volunteer, called Mark, says the floodwater was very polluted for drinking, but also dangerous if it comes in contact with the skin.
You see exhaustion, you see weak people who were evacuated and went through a very hard physical few hours, and they are exhausted. Their existing conditions speak out. Yeah, if we're talking about patients who are lying down and are being evacuated to the next spot with our ambulances because they cannot sit in a car, they cannot walk. The water is very polluted for drinking, but also for your skin, for any existing conditions, even for the wet clothes the volunteers are going into these waters. They need to dry them in the sun because it can have serious effect on your health, on your skin.
The World Health Organization has rushed emergency supplies to Ukraine after the breach of the Kakhovka Dam, which led to widespread flooding. Asked specifically about cholera, the technical officer, Teresa Zakaria, said the risk of an outbreak was present because the pathogen exists in the environment, adding that the World Health Organization was working with Ukraine's health ministry to ensure that vaccines can be imported if needed. Britain is still seeking to establish what exactly caused the appalling destruction of the dam on the front line between Russian and Ukrainian forces. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, says this during a visit to the United States. The major Soviet-era dam in the Russian-controlled part of southern Ukraine was breached on Tuesday, unleashing torrents of floodwater across the war zone in what both Ukraine and Russia said was an intentional attack by the other's forces. The British Prime Minister is in the United States hoping to build deeper economic ties with the Americans. Prime Minister Sunak plans to speak to U.S. President Joe Biden on artificial intelligence, AI, as Britain aims to host the first summit of the issue this autumn to discuss how the risks of AI can be mitigated through internationally coordinated action.
So we're still establishing definitively the cause of the attack on the dam in Ukraine, but I want people to know that we're playing our part to support the Ukrainians in their response. We've provided resources to the United Nations and the Red Cross in advance, anticipating incidents like this. Those resources are now being moved into the region to help support those families affected. This is an appalling act, and hundreds of thousands of people are being affected by it. We'll continue to provide support for the Ukraine. I think the UK is well placed to take a leadership role in shaping the conversation about how we regulate AI so that we can enjoy its benefits, of which clearly there are many, but do so in a way that protects our countries and citizens and make sure it's used safely and securely. The UK's research-based companies, everything points to us having a leading role in this, and our ability to move quickly to put regulation in place is really important in an industry and technology that itself is changing very rapidly. I'll be discussing that with President Biden today. I'm delighted the US is supporting our summit, and I've also spoken to the companies involved about this when I convened them in Downing Street a few weeks ago. I think they're also keen to support the UK in helping to develop what needs to be a global architecture for regulation ultimately.
And the global regulator in UK?
I think that we need to start the conversation about what the type of regulation we need is. The exact form that will take will be the type of topic that one would hope we can discuss. But it's important that we do put guardrails in place so we can enjoy the benefits of AI safely and securely. And as I said, the UK can play a leadership role on this. It's something I'm particularly interested in myself, and I think it will be to the benefit of our country.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. His counterpart in the United States, US President Joe Biden, believes the US will have the necessary funding to support Ukraine for as long as it takes as Russia continues its invasion. President Biden also says it remains to be seen whether it's time for a British Secretary General of NATO, adding that the organization's allies need to discuss candidates for the leadership role. Prime Minister Sunak had been expected to try to win President Biden's backing for Defense Minister Ben Wallace's bid to become the next NATO chief.
Your unwavering support for the people of Ukraine.
Today, we'll also discuss our unwavering support for the people of Ukraine and who are defending themselves against the most brutal aggression we've seen in a long time at the hands of Russia and Putin. The UK and the United States, together with more than 50 partners, have committed historic levels of security assistance to Ukraine. And I want to thank the Prime Minister for his strong leadership, contributing significant amounts of security assistance and training Ukrainian troops so they can effectively use the equipment and ammunition we've collectively provided them. In talks with Ukrainians and particularly with Zelensky and our allies and partners on commitments to Ukraine, long-term security to deter future aggression after this war ends is the goal. And we're advancing this goal by providing them the support Ukraine needs now on the battlefield and helping them strengthen their military over the long term. The fact of the matter is that I believe we'll have the funding necessary to support Ukraine as long as it takes.
The UK is proud of our contribution, including providing tanks, long-range weapons, and training Ukrainian soldiers. But let no one doubt, US leadership and resources are the decisive contribution allowing the forces of democracy and freedom to prevail. We're lucky to have America's investment in European security, but we need to share the burden alongside you, which is why defence spending in the UK has been above the 2% NATO benchmark. It's on an increasing trajectory, and we would encourage other countries to follow the lead that the US and the UK set, because our security is collective.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, earlier President of the United States, Joe Biden. Now, back in Russia, alongside flooding, Ukrainians also in Ukraine face the risk of mines moving following the destruction of the huge hydroelectric Kyiv dam on front lines between Russia and Ukrainian forces on Tuesday. A global research officer at HALO, Andrew Matheson, says his team uncovered 5,000 mines in the Kyiv region last month alone, likely a fraction of the total amount of unexploded ordnances embedded in the area.
The immediate threat to us and our staff and civilians is the fact that mines might move, and that will lead to the need for us to resurvey these areas, remark them as minefields, and obviously reorganize ourselves in terms of how to approach the clearance problems. Beyond that, the mines might not only move, but they might also fluctuate in terms of the way they're laid, which poses another risk for our staff that they need to be prepared for once we're able to clear the mines. It's most of the southern reaches of the Mykolaiv Oblast where Halo's working, and obviously, so that's the northern bank of the Dnipro River and both sides of the Inhalets River, which feeds into the Dnipro from north to south. Comparable sizes is difficult to say, but probably about the size of Greater London, I think, is a good comparative area. Yeah, unfortunately, not a lot. So our teams we're constantly monitoring this, both my team that's monitoring social media and satellite imagery, and our teams are on the ground monitoring the increased risk due to possible movement of landmines. In terms of civilians, it really is, being very vigilant, and it's obviously goes beyond just not stepping on it. It's, not approaching anything that might seem dangerous, not engaging with it, and calling the state authorities in Ukraine and making them aware of that threat. It's basically impossible to give an estimate. I mean, the contamination is so massive. The conflict is ongoing. The size of Ukraine itself, the front line is 1,200 miles. Unfortunately, it's just really impossible to say. That could be 1%, could be 0.0001.
One of Russia's longest-serving and most respected human rights campaigners went on trial on Thursday, facing the prospect of 3 years in jail if convicted of repeatedly discrediting Russia's armed forces. Since 1999, Oleg Orlov has been one of the leaders of Memorial, which won a share of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022, a year after being banned and dissolved in Russia. Since sending its tanks into Ukraine in February 2022, Moscow has intensified a long-running clampdown on all forces and forms of political dissent and made it an offense to discredit the armed forces or deviate from government accounts. Sentences range up to 15 years in jail, although comments deemed to constitute treason, such as those for which opposition politician Vladimir Kara-Murza was jailed in April, can be punished by life imprisonment. Mr. Orlov, who came to prominence by opposing Soviet totalitarianism, told the independent Moscow Times last month that campaigners like him were to some extent following the path of anti-communist dissidents of the Cold War era. Mr. Orlov had already been fined for holding anti-war banners in public. The new charges are based on an article he wrote denouncing Russia for waging the conflict. His defense team included Dmitry Muratov, editor of the now-banned independent newspaper Novaya Gazeta, and also a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize for his decades of work to defend freedom of speech in Russia. Irina Markovich used to sleep in summer with her windows and balconies open at night. Nowadays, she shuts them before going to bed in order to block out the sound of explosions. The blasts, some distant, some uncomfortably close, have become a daily reality for Markovich and her neighbors in the Russian town of Razumunye, a 35-minute border drive from the border with Ukraine. So too has the occasional boom of Russian air defenses directed against incoming missiles or drones. Locals can no longer ignore the fact that Russia's own territory has become vulnerable since it launched its special military operation, as it calls it, against Ukraine 15 months ago, even if they are reluctant to discuss the reasons why. Markovich's neighbor, Natalia Cherkashina, who is about 65 years of age, says that what once seemed like a faraway conflict has now come very close to home. It was only when nearby forces started to come under fire, she said, reeling off names of villages in the region, that the reality sank in. Governor of the surrounding Belgorod region, Vyacheslav Gladkov, says 2 apartments' balconies and a power line in Razumunye have been damaged after Russian air defenses fired on incoming aerial targets overnight, but no one was injured. Thousands of Russians living near the Ukrainian border have moved to nearby Belgorod in the wake of a major cross-border incursion last month by two militia groups made up of Russians fighting on the side of Ukraine. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has demanded the delivery of military hardware and ammunition to the forces engaged in Ukraine be accelerated. Video footage shows him inspecting a storage facility said to be in Russia's western military district. The new armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks are urgently needed on the battlefield, he told logistics officers and representatives of the military industry. He reiterated that Russian forces had thwarted Ukrainian counterattack in Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia region on Thursday. The Russian Defense Ministry also released further drone footage showing what it said were Russian strikes against Ukrainian tanks in Zaporizhzhia region. Now let's speak to public affairs analyst Mr. Ralph Obasoje, who is speaking to us from Lekki here in Lagos, Southwest Nigeria. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm still in London, so I'm talking to you from London, actually. I've been listening on this thing, but yeah.
Yes. Thank you for the correction. You're in London. It's good to have you with us on the show this morning.
All right.
Now, let's begin where in the Kakhovka Dam destruction, it appears that both sides are fighting a battle on two fronts. There's the ecological disaster that has happened, which President Zelensky calls ecocide, as opposed to genocide, accusing the Russians of doing that. And now there's the military conflict as well. But even though Ukraine has accused Russia of being the perpetrators, Russia, they themselves have admitted that some Russian forces in a particular area in that region had to retreat because of the flood waters. As this conflict continues, what is your impression that things are getting from bad to worse?
Yes, in any sustained conflict, military conflict at that, things can only get back from bad to worse if genuine efforts are not made to bring about peace between the warring sides. And that is where we've been directing our opinion. The propaganda has been one-sided. And we have always, the group I belong to, have always propagated the suggestion that the efforts that the West has put in terms of financial resources and military hardware could have better been directed towards getting both sides to dialogue and achieve peace. And in terms of reclaiming territories, it can also be done through dialogue, as long as both parties get to the stage where they don't feel threatened by each other. And that is where we thought the effort should be going to. As at the last count, I don't even follow it again, because as at the last count, the West has collectively put in more than $17 trillion in terms of military hardware, military aircraft, and financial resources to support Ukraine. Whereas, if they had assuaged the fears of the Russians, talk to the Russian leader, actually address his genuine fears, it should have been peace. Like I said sometime when I appeared on this channel, there is no leader of a country that will sit idling by when its citizens in another territory are being cleansed out. In an attempt to reclaim Crimea and Donetsk, the Ukrainian regime, Zelensky, took some extreme decisions, ethnic cleansing, banning the Russian language, and harassing and arresting the Russians. The world didn't see that. And then the Russian government comes in to protect those people, amongst every other reasons for the invasion, including the feeling of insecurity and the growing army of Ukraine by the US and its allies. That was the reason. And that was why we also said the world should pursue genuine peace, like the Chinese are trying to do. We look at the Minsk II agreement. It is still a platform for peace. And I still think that the West should look at that Minsk agreement critically, refine it, and begin to engage in dialogue with Putin. you heard about the so-called preparation for counteroffensive. As you may well have known, and I heard you mentioning it in your rundown to bringing me on, that even the counteroffensive failed in two fronts, woefully, because the Russians were prepared for it. So if this war is going to become an internecine war, a war that will drag on forever with people suffering, they are talking about how many Ukrainians have died. In the last count, there are more than 1.2 million that have died. Over 300 medical facilities have been destroyed. Over 1,200 schools have been closed. Over 2 million children are out of school. Their lives, to reconstruct their lives, will be a bit difficult. So why not pursue peace? That is what we're advocating.
There are two sides to the story, and both sides are playing the blame game now in this instance. So the thin line between both sides is that there is no compromise as far as their demands are concerned, or what they're willing to give in, and that's why mediation hasn't yielded enough fruit. What do you see as Ukraine doing to yield to a certain degree, and what do you see Russia should do to yield to a certain degree so that these peace talks that you're talking of can come to fruition?
No, I think Russia will bow to genuine world pressure, not the bullying that they are being subjected to now. I talked about the drive towards how would I call it, a unipolar world, which is actually the underlying driving force for what is being done. And the Russians have shown resilience, unpredictable resilience, because perhaps some people thought that they could just be overrun. Like the Defense Secretary, the U.S. Defense Secretary mentioned on CNN once, he said the Ukraine war was meant and orchestrated and meant to weaken Russia. We are watching, and I don't think a unipolar world will augur well for the world. There is need for a counterbalance, and for all those who love this kind of counterbalance, should actually push for peace. The blame, in propaganda, both sides will say the things that will favor them. But as a discerning human being and a pragmatic human being, you know where the truth lies, because no matter how much you try to suppress the truth, it will always stand up. You understand? Like the Kakhovka dam damage. Russia is not one to mince words. If Russia damaged it, they would tap it as a battle success. But they said outright, we didn't do it. And of course, there are reasons for people to believe that they didn't do it, because number one, they are still holding on to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which is a strategic plant. And the other side in this battle have been trying all means to dislodge them from that nuclear plant. So from that nuclear plant, Russia is determining who it gives electric power. They are using it to power the territories they've conquered. That is why the plant is strategic. And they cannot be battled there, because you know what will happen if the nuclear plant is hit. Everybody around there will not be safe from radiation and other ecological disasters. So, and again, another reason why they couldn't have done it is that that they get the water for the cooling of the plant from this dam, from the Kakhovka dam. So how would somebody who is holding on to a precious facility damage a source that enables it to maintain and cool the facility? The one thing you cannot rule out is that some heavy shells from many of the sites during engagement may have landed on the dam and damaged its banks. That one again cannot be ruled out. But you can imagine the disaster that is happening there now. Look at people being evacuated already. Nobody knows how many people must have been submerged in the water and died. They are still looking for bodies to float. We just hope that innocent persons have not died from this disaster.
Indeed, but both sides stand to lose from the destruction of the dam. For those that say the Ukrainians are responsible, for those that say the Russians are responsible, both sides are losing concerning the destruction of the dam, to the point of where you mentioned about the supply of water for the nuclear power plant's cooling. There's a reservoir, a pond, that the IAEA have said that that's enough to take them for a few months. So if Russia was nefariously trying to destroy the dam, knowing that there's an option that they can fall back on for the nuclear power plant, then that's a strategy for them. But going to the visit of Rishi Sunak to the United States and their obviously very cozy cooperation concerning the Ukraine war, it goes against the grain of what you've just said. Both sides should come to the negotiation table. One thing that sticks out like a sore thumb is that they're talking about their support for Ukraine notwithstanding. They're not talking as much about peaceful reconciliation.
Yeah, I don't know if you were fortunate to listen to a former government minister of Ukraine under the former pro-Russian government. She was very vociferous, and she actually the European Union because she was on air on Al Jazeera saying these are all for commercial purposes. You understand? You and I know that Russia manufactures its weapons from government-owned facilities. It doesn't buy. It has all the raw materials to make their weapons. It doesn't import anyone. But in the West, for them to make one single shell, they have to pay for it. They have to buy it. And if there's no war, then those industries, they can't thrive, they can't be sustained. So that is why she was very vociferous in saying this is for commercial purposes. And I was just nodding my head in agreement. I don't understand. You see,
are you saying that the United States is profiteering? Sorry, are you saying the United States is profiteering and some nations are trying to profiteer from the war?
Yes, because they have to patronize their weapons manufacturing industries. They have to give contracts to get manufactured weapons. It's not like the communist Russia who owns all the weapon manufacturing facilities. So it's a different ballgame. And the woman was very apt in whatever she said, a very senior government minister, former government minister of Ukraine. So, and you also remember, I mentioned in my last appearance about the fact that you knew Donald Trump was trying to investigate the son of the current president of the United States for supplying weapons then to Ukraine, unauthorized supply of weapons to Ukraine. I don't know if you followed it. So yes. That was there, but unfortunately, power changed hands and this war happened. But in spite of that, because I thought the world should learn from Iraq, invasion of Iraq, learn from Afghanistan. This was the same talk. We're going to conquer Afghanistan. They kept on pumping weapons. Lives were destroyed. Innocent lives. Children's lives. Children who are innocent, who have the right to live for tomorrow, who have the right to take over this world from us. You and I who are aging. They were wiped off the hand. At the end of the day, was the objective attained? It was not. So every peace-loving individual should seek for peace because war is not beautiful.
Indeed, this falls in the ambits of what we can call conspiracy theories, where they say the United States encourages wars in some places and then supplies the weapons, but that is not proven. In this case, we know that Russia happens to be, they drew first blood, as they say. They're the ones that fired the first salvo. They're the ones that crossed into another country's sovereign territory, regardless of the reasons that they gave for doing that. So it's expected that the whole world will paint Russia as the bad guy and paint them with the brush that, okay, you people are the people, you are the aggressors. This is an invasion. It's not a special military operation. You've spoken to the effect that both sides watching the conflict should be fair in their estimation. But what about Russia themselves? Should they have undertaken, or should President Putin's administration have undertaken this enterprise without more circumspection?
Yeah, I don't think there was any, because there were warnings. Putin, like I said, the Russians are a bit crude and very direct. There were warnings to say, hey, stop the ethnic cleansing. Stop your bid to want to join NATO. Stop hobnobbing with the West because it doesn't make us safe. A fully military armed Ukraine was not comfortable for Russia. And when Putin was going to invade, a night before he invaded, he did a press conference. And he didn't mince words. Every reason why he was going to invade, he stated them in the press conference. He chronicled everything from the 2 world wars, and then went to the Minsk I agreement, Minsk II agreement, and then went to the activities of the Ukrainian government and says the Russian government is not feeling safe because of this inpouring of arms into Ukraine, because all those things were done for Ukraine to be able to invade Crimea and reclaim Crimea. As good as the intention was on the part of the Ukrainians, the issue of banning the Russian language in territories where you have predominant Russians didn't go down well with ethnic Russians. And of course, they called on their government. Now, you're talking about they were the first to fire the first shot. And nobody supports them for that. Nobody should support any country because you are mighty. You want to now invade smaller countries or less powerful countries. But look at those who are shouting Blue Murder. What have they done themselves? What happened to Panama? To Emmanuel Noriega in Panama? What happened to him? What happened to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua? What happened to Libya? Gaddafi was murdered in cold blood. And today, because of that disruption in Libya, the whole Maghreb, including Nigeria, is not safe. All the weapons the militants are using, insurgents are using, check all the rifles. They are Libyan marked rifles. So if Libya was not disrupted and Gaddafi was in power, the Maghreb would be safe, Nigeria would be safe. So you're doing, because they say, walk the talk. Do like you have said. Don't say, do like I'm saying, don't do like I've done. Whether Russia, whether the West, any country that unilaterally invades another country should be condemned. But we are saying the war is there now. Who is right or who is wrong is not the issue. It is for the world to then propagate peace, go on via the route of dialogue. And when the Russians feel comfortable, I'm sure they will yield territories. Perhaps not the territories where you have predominant ethnic Russians. And of course, you know what happened with Crimea, because the whole the Black Sea Fleet, the naval power of Russia, was in the Crimea, was in the Black Sea. And there was no way they could give up Crimea. All these things are coming from the sudden dissolution of the USSR. In such an abrupt and immediate dissolution, you don't have time to sit down and negotiate boundaries. You understand? So you then ask yourself, what is the actual boundary between Ukraine and Russia? Because if you go back to history, Ukraine has been like the wife of Russia. So where are the actual boundaries? We should sue for peace. I'm surprised that the African leaders, I don't know if you know whether they went or not. I can't see, I've not monitored any news where they were said to have gone to both Kyiv and Moscow like they are touted. I don't know what happened.
No, they're going to do that. Cyril Ramaphosa has just, I think yesterday, said that he's reached out to both sides, and President Putin, on his part, has said that that peace mission from Africa is most welcome. But we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your thoughts on this issue. In the grand stage of international politics, you mentioned how the United States has been accused of doing the very thing that they're saying Russia is attempting to do. So that's food for thought.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Mr. Ralph Obasoje, public affairs analyst who joined us from London.
Thank you very much. And thanks for having me again today.
Our pleasure. Kremlin says the ammonia pipeline blast can only be negative for grain deal. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the second half of our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. In Russia, the Kremlin is reporting that a blast on the Togliatti-Odessa ammonia pipeline was a complicating factor that could only have a negative impact. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov restated Russia's position that a resumption of the pipeline's work was an integral part of the Black Sea grain deal, the renewal of which Russia has repeatedly cast doubt in recent weeks. Commenting on a media report which says the United States knew of a Ukrainian plan to attack the Nord Stream natural gas pipeline, the Kremlin says it has already spoken of the possible involvement of what it calls Anglo-Saxons in the incident. Citing leaked information posted online, The Washington Post reported that the CIA learned last June through a European spy agency that a 6-person team of Ukrainian Special Operations Forces intended to blow up the Russia to Germany project. Several unexplained underwater explosions ruptured the Nord Stream 1 and newly built Nord Stream 2 pipeline that link Russia and Germany across the Baltic Sea in September 2022. Kyiv has told the Hague-based International Court of Justice that Moscow violated a UN anti-terrorism treaty by equipping and funding pro-Russian forces, including militia who shut down the Malaysian airline flight MH17, killing all 298 passengers and crew in 2014. Last November, a Dutch court convicted 2 Russians and a Ukrainian separatist in absentia for their role and sentenced them to life in prison. It found that Russia had overall control over the separatist forces. Russia has rejected that. They call it a scandalous decision by the Dutch court. Russia's ambassador at large, Gennady Kuzmin, told the ICJ that the Dutch judgment was biased against separatist forces in the Donetsk region. Now, the court adjourned on Thursday, but will hold 2 more days of hearing next week, where Ukraine and Russia can react to each other's submissions. The Russian Foreign Ministry says it has every intention of responding to what it calls Romania's hostile decision to reduce Russia's diplomatic presence in the country. Romania's Foreign Ministry said earlier that it was ordering Russia to cut 51 of its embassy staff, citing poor bilateral relations over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And now we'll speak to Ini John Mekwa, our business correspondent, to find how the world of business is affecting the conflict and vice versa. Ini.
Good morning.
Good morning. Eurozone now in recession.
Yes.
Did they see this coming?
The
UK had threats of some sort of recession.
And then they were able to escape
recently.
yes, and have marginal growth. And we also saw this coming for Europe, but then we now thought it was averted because the issue of energy is a major driver of this inflation, the increase in energy cost and all of that. But, you know, when they had that strategic plan to fill up their tanks with gas for energy production, and then the weather wasn't as bad as analysts thought it would be, that means there was less demand for gas. That means the expenses for energy through gas was reduced, wasn't as much as a lot of people thought it would be. We thought we had escaped this, but unfortunately there was a drop in the quarter growth of last year, of the last quarter of 2022, 0.1% down. Also, the first quarter just came out, and 2 negative quarters equals to a recession. So that's why we have this. So we know that the major driver of this is energy costs, because European countries, I think we got about Germany going to recession last week. We had that, but now Ireland, Netherlands, they have also joined. But we know that the zone itself depended so much on Russia, Gazprom, they even have a joint company where they get the gas, for energy and all of that. And so cutting that off abruptly has been a major source. So even though they have tried to get gas and other sources of energy, we know that, they've resurrected some other forms of energy, but it hasn't, it's only going to take time. Because
would you say that all the European countries are
in the
Eurozone are in this recession?
Then the big ones are in the recession, and the report is that they are in recession. The zone is in recession. I guess because you have, Germany is the biggest economy there, and Germany has been in recession for about 2 weeks now or so. And then you have the other countries, Netherlands and Ireland, also joining at this time. So it's the numbers. It's what the numbers are saying. 2 negative quarters is equal to recession. There was a negative quarter growth last year, 2022, the last quarter, and this first quarter now, it's a negative one. So that's equal to a recession.
How do you think it affects the standard of living, or that's a more long-term negative consequence?
Well, what it just does is people spend more to maintain their lifestyle status that they used to have. And of course, some people will have to compromise, because if you used to take 2 sachets of milk, for instance, for your cup of tea, and now the price for those 2 sachets is equal to 1, then you might just buy 1, and see if things will get better. It's just like what we're doing here in Nigeria. You used to fill your tank with 15,000 naira, for instance. Now it costs you 20,000 naira to fill your tank. So when you want to drive out, you ask yourself, how important is this place? And I think we saw it here. I think the first week after the subsidy was removed, we did see that the roads were empty. Like a lot of people were asking themselves, do I really need to go out? So it's the same thing. You adjust when things, but you also have to remember that when we see these numbers are lags. So, for instance, Nigeria is awaiting inflation number for May, but we are already in June. So by the time you get the number, you have already felt the impact, and perhaps you have adjusted to it knowingly or unknowingly at this time. So it's the same with everywhere in the world. So you used to watch your television and use your electricity, every time you are home. But now, because it costs you more, you are more conscious of it.
How can things get back up for the Eurozone countries?
Well, I guess it can get back up when there's more supply. I know they're working on plans on how to get electricity sources. So when that becomes...
So this is a power thing, it's a gas...
It's mostly a power thing that feeds into food and feeds into transportation, and all of that. But it comes majorly from the war because of that abrupt cuts from connection of gas.
One of the highlights of any Prime Minister of the UK's state visits will be to go over to the United States.
Yeah, he just finished his visit yesterday. Yesterday was the final day of that visit of the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in Washington D.C. And I think they just brought back something that they started in 1941. They have this, they call it Atlantic Declaration. And we know that I think the closest ally of the UK is the US and vice versa. That's what the world knows. So wherever the UK goes, the US also goes. So they've had this since 1941, trying to be each other defense and all of that. But then when they started it with Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt of the United States, it was more about war, because I think they were just done with the war and all that. But now they're reviving it to include economic partnership. They've always had that, but I guess it's just especially the issue of energy transition. Energy is a huge one at this time for everybody.
Look, from Winston Churchill, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, Theresa May, these relations between both countries seem to be very solid. Although at times it could be better. But in this particular case, the Atlantic Declaration, it cuts across trade and all other sectors?
Yes, it does. And that's what I'm saying. I think what they have just done, what the Prime Minister has done, or what this conversation has done, this fresh one, is to highlight today's needs, which includes energy transition. I don't think that was there when, in the past, when they had it, okay. But with the war going on and the issue of energy and sources of energy top on the list and driving inflation in different economies, that is now part of it. And they've decided to collaborate and help each other, even though there's still the talks that what the UK really needs now is free trade since they left, since Brexit, because they really need it. They've had a lot of obstruction in imports and exports and duties and all of that because they exited the zone. So perhaps that's what they really need. But, energy transition is also very big on the Atlantic Declaration from the visit of the Prime Minister.
Thanks a lot, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
More from Ini John Mekwa on Business Morning after this program. And finally, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has visited the Kherson hospital, which has been treating people escaping floods caused by the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. Early on Thursday, he met local officials to discuss emergency operations. Kherson's governor had reported earlier that 600 square kilometers of the region was underwater, most of it Russian-occupied side of the river. Nearly 2,000 people have already been affected and left those affected areas. That's where we call it a day for this coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend.
I appreciate the question. With